All right, a good Yantiv, a good Vach, a farbrengen Chanuka. Today, we read in the Torah about Yosef HaTzadik, and the Torah describes Yosef as a man of success. But there's a slight nuance. The Torah's description of Yosef's success, as the Torah describes it in the 5th section of this Torah portion, now the Torah describes it in the 6th section of the Torah, and basically what comes out is that Yosef has one level of success when he is a slave of the Pharaoh's butcher, Potiphar, but he has more of a Midas touch after he goes into prison. Whatever he touches, Hashem causes success. Zalman, can you please turn off that thing? Zalman? Yisraelik? All right, we'll figure it out later. So
we can't hear it, whatever it is.
Okay, great. So the Torah described Joseph as being more successful when he was in prison than when he was a slave. And in short, the difference between Joseph's success outside of prison and outside of when he was free, when he wasn't a slave, versus Yosef being a slave and being in prison is that Yosef's spiritual life mirrored his physical life. So when Yosef was a servant, he also became more of a servant of Hashem. And when Yosef became a prisoner, the difference between a servant and a prisoner is that when you're a servant, you may be totally subservient to your master, but you're still a separate entity. When you're a prisoner, you can't move without the permission of your captors. So just like Yosef became more subservient to his captors when he became a prison more than when he was a servant, so too in the service of Hashem he became more in the hands of Hashem, more in the state of total devotion to Hashem when he was a prisoner than when he was just a servant. So let's think of it this way. Yankel is it's 9/11, and Yankel is heading to the Twin Towers to do his job, and he notices that Tower 1 goes down. And instead of instead of just hanging around, as soon as he sees the first tower go down, he says, maybe this tower will go down too, and he rushes out, and he escapes. So he rushes out, he did something, and Hashem caused his rushing out to work, and he's successful, and he escapes. He did something, and Hashem caused his actions to be successful. That's one kind of success. Then there's another kind of success where he's on the way to work, and the police officer stops him and says, "You cannot you can't go further, and we need to stop you over here. You need to come into the station to answer a few questions." So, although he is delayed, but it saves his life, and of course he's very happy. There's a difference between these two different kinds of success stories. One is the person, in the first story, the guy did some smart moves, and God brought success to his smart moves. But in the second story, the guy didn't do anything. He can't attribute anything to himself. The police officer stopped him. The police officer brought him into the station, and that's what saved his life. So when a person considers his own genius, his own gift, as being significant, he sort of pushes away Hashem's hand. But the more devoted he is to Hashem and the more reliant he is on Hashem, the more he's open to Hashem's success in a more miraculous way. And that's why when Yosef was just a servant, he had one level of success, which was still beyond the level of success he had when he was free. And when Yosef became a prisoner and he reached a higher level of service of Hashem, where he had no sense of self at all, that's when Hashem gave him a whole different kind of success, a miraculous success. And so the message for us is obvious that, as the famous teaching of the Baal Shem Tov on chapter 13 in Tehillim, how long will you forget me, King David says? How long will you hide your face from me? And King David continues and says, how long will I need to figure things out? So the Baal Shem Tov says, as long as a person thinks, I have to figure things out, that's how long Hashem hides. As long as a person says, I have to figure things out, that's how long Hashem forgets him, so to speak. It seems like Hashem forgets him. But the more we feel like we're not really in control, we feel like the servant, or we feel like a slave, we feel that we can't make a move without Hashem, the more openly clear do we see Hashem's miraculous blessing and protection beyond nature. So on that note, I want to share with you tonight one or two stories, depending on how long it takes to say the first story. And this is how it goes. This is the story of Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald. Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald's son, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Greenwald, lived in New York, and he shared the story of his father. He said like this: his father, Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald, was the oldest of 7 children, and his mother became a widow, or his father passed away, and she didn't want her oldest son not to have a proper Torah education, so she sent her son to Warsaw, to one of the most prominent Torah giants of his time, Rabbi Menachem Zemba, Shamin Kumdomo, who was eventually killed by the Nazis in Machshamam. So she sent her son to Rabbi Zemba to learn from him, and Rabbi Zemba, among all the other Torah giants of his time, went to the Rebbe's wedding. Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald arrived at his home when he was 8 years old. He lived in his home. They were related. This was his uncle, and he stayed there for years. And he joined Rabbi Zemba to visit the previous Rebbe and the Rebbe for the Rebbe's wedding. Years later, when Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald was already the age of 17 years old, and after the wedding, Rabbi Zemba went with this boy, Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald, to visit the Rebbe in the Rebbe's hotel that he was staying in after the wedding. And Rabbi Zemba and the Rebbe conversed in Torah at a level that far surpassed this young man, Rabbi Greenwald. And Torah discussion went back and forth. But there's one thing that the Rebbe said that he remembered. The Rebbe's wedding was on the 14th of Kislev. And the Rebbe said that we're approaching now the days of Chanuka, and on Chanuka, there's one night of Chanuka that can never fall out on Shabbos. That's the 5th night of Chanuka. And that night is considered to be a special day among Chassidim. We can make that day to be a special day of celebration, even though it seems like that's a day which have the least celebration, because that's a day when which can't fall out on Shabbos, which seems to be more of a darker day. It can't fall out on Shabbos. But nevertheless, the Rebbe said that's the unique power of a Jew, that a Jew, no matter what's going on, no matter how dark it is, the Rebbe said whether a Jew is in Warsaw or in London, nevertheless, a Jew is always able to bring light to his surroundings. And that's why the Chassidim make a special emphasis of celebrating the 5th night of Chanukah, highlighting that although it is a dark day on the surface, because it can't fall out on Shabbos, yet this is the unique power of a Jew that is able to bring light into a place of darkness, whether he's in Warsaw or he's in London. That's what the Rebbe shared then. And so, powerful message, and they depart, and Rabbi Zemba was very, very impressed, and he couldn't stop talking to anyone who visited him the next couple of days and weeks about the genius of the new Eidim, the new son-in-law of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. 20 years go by. These 20 years, it was a Holocaust, and Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald lost in the Holocaust his wife and his brothers and sisters. And after the Holocaust, he managed to make it to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in Tafshin Ches in 1948. And in Philadelphia, he had his uncle there, Moshe Chaim Greenwald, who was a Amshnover Chassid and Amshnover Rebbe, and they assisted him to rebuild his life. They introduced him to his bride-to-be, who herself was from a prominent prominent family. Her father's name was Zisha Sinkevitz, and she also survived the Holocaust and suffered a lot together with her sister. But eventually, she survived, and she was raised in Toronto by a very important member of the community in Toronto, Mr. Couple Schwartz. And Mr. Couple Schwartz was her uncle, her Rabbi C. Grunwald's mother's uncle, and that's where she stayed. And so when she was introduced to Moshe Chaim Grunwald to be married, her uncle, and the one who hosted her and took care of her, he wanted to visit the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe to get a blessing for their marriage. This was 20 years after Rabbi Grunwald had visited the Rebbe by the Rebbe's wedding, and now he's 20 years later. He himself is going to getting married, and he comes together with Couple Schwartz to the previous Rebbe to get a blessing. And at the when they visit, the previous Rebbe said that since you were by the wedding of my son-in-law, so it's worthwhile, now that you're here, to also go and say hello to my son-in-law as well. You're here, you might as well come and say hello to my son-in-law. So, after visiting the previous Rebbe and getting the blessing from the previous Rebbe, they went down to the Rebbe's office, which was in the same place that it always continued to be even after the Rebbe assumed leadership of Chabad. And when they visited, the Rebbe asked about the final days of Rabbi Zemba's life, who was killed by the Nazis, and the Rebbe said the same teaching they had sent 20 years before about the fifth night of Chanuka. He repeated. The Rebbe says, we're now approaching Chanuka. On Chanuka, there is the fifth night of Chanuka, which Chassidim consider to be a very special day, and they celebrate it. And even though the fifth night of Chanuka is a time, it would seem, of darkness, because it can never fall out on Shabbos, and yet that's a night that's celebrated because a Jew can always illuminate his surroundings. That's the unique power of a Jew, no matter how dark it is. Whether a Jew is in New York or a Jew is in London, a Jew is always empowered to illuminate their surroundings. So this was a total shock to Rabbi Moshe Levin. The Rebbe is repeating the same thing that he said 20 years before. The Rebbe recognized them, and he's sharing the same thing he said 20 years before. It's so strange. And yes, 20 years before they were he was in Warsaw. Now going to be living in New York. He worked in Washington Heights in a shul called Adas Yisrael. And so Rebbe's words were pertinent to where he was, whether you're in New York, but in London, again, I mentioned Warsaw. The first time he visited the Rebbe said whether you're in Warsaw or London. Now the Rebbe said whether you're in New York or London, wherever you are, a Jew has the power to give light to the darkness, and that's the theme of the fifth night of Chanukah, to give light to the darkness. That's what the Rebbe said, and the Rebbe gave him a blessing for his marriage. And eventually, Rabbi Grunwald and his wife moved back to Toronto, where she was raised after the Holocaust, and they lived in a Satmar community in Toronto, and it was there they were blessed with a son and a daughter, and their son was the one who was sharing the story, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Grunwald. So Moshe Chaim Grunwald grows up, and it's time for him to get married. So in 1959, before his marriage, his father wanted to bring him to the Rebbe to get a blessing for his marriage. So he traveled together with his son to visit the Rebbe in New York. And when they come to the Rebbe right away again recognizes them immediately. This is the first time that his son saw the Rebbe. This was his third time visiting the Rebbe. So the Rebbe said that the Rebbe told his father, since you caused me joy and you came to my wedding, so too Hashem should bless you. You should also be able to celebrate the wedding of your grandchild. That's what the Rebbe said. You should be able to celebrate the wedding of your grandchild. So Rabbi Greenwald, he said, I want to take this opportunity and I want to ask the Rebbe a question. He said, I'm living among Satmar Chassidim, and although at that time there was a lot of friction between Satmar and Lubavitch, and there's a lot of things that were being said that were very leave a lot to be desired. But he said he said that I don't listen to all the negative things, but I do have a question. The question I have is this: Satmar Chassidim are saying that there's a verse which seems to be exactly the opposite of what Lubavitch is trying to do. It says in the Torah, Misenecha Hashem Esna, those who hate you, O God, I hate too. So he asked the Rebbe, if the Torah says you're supposed to hate those who hate God, so how is it that Chabad reaches out to all Jews, even those who are estranged from their Judaism, those who are against Judaism, those who are heretical? Doesn't the Torah say, I hate those who hate you? Aren't you supposed to hate those who hate God? So he said, I want to ask this question because I want to be able to respond to those who ask me this. He says, I have a neighbor, and this neighbor always asks me this, and my neighbor, and I just want to know what I'm supposed to say. I don't accept the negative speech people say about the Rebbe, but I want to know what the answer is. So Rebbe became very serious, closed his eyes, and he said this. The Rebbe said, what would your neighbor do if, God forbid, his daughter would become herself distanced from her Judaism? What would your neighbor do if his own daughter left Judaism? Would he say the same thing? Would he say, I hate those who hate you? Or would he say, as the Talmud says, you cannot ignore your own flesh and blood? Is that what he would say? Obviously, he wouldn't say, I hate those who hate you. He would say, you can't ignore your flesh and blood. So the Rebbe continued, for Hashem, every Jew is an only child. And my father-in-law, the Rebbe said, for my father-in-law, every Jew was his flesh and blood. And therefore, you can't ignore even one Jew because every Jew is really our family. Just like you wouldn't ignore your family, you can't ignore any Jew because we're all family. That's what the Rebbe said. And then the Rebbe continued and repeated that same teaching, now for the third time. The teaching that he had heard for the first time at the Rebbe's wedding, and then a second time 20 years later in 1948, and now a third time in 1959. The Rebbe said the same teaching. Now we're approaching the days of Chanuka. And on Chanuka, there's one day that Chassidim especially celebrate, and that's the fifth night of Chanuka. And why is it a day of celebration? Because although on the surface this day is a day of, it seems to be a negative day because it cannot fall out on Shabbat, can't fall out on Shabbos, yet this is the power of a Jew, that a Jew is able to bring light into the darkness, even a place which seems to be dark, yet a Jew is able to bring light into that dark place. And the Rebbe said, whether you are in Toronto or you're in London, a Jew has to always bring light to his surroundings. That's what the Rebbe said. So, about 10 years pass, and this man, Rabbi Moshe Greenwald's younger brother, gets married, and he gets married to someone in London. And so Rabbi Greenwald Senior, Rabbi Ramsey Greenwald, his son of Moshe Chaim Greenwald, and his brother and his brother-in-law, and they all go together to the wedding in London. And Rabbi Greenwald Jr., Rabbi Moshe Chaim Greenwald, notices that his father is something's bothering him. His son's getting married, but something's really bothering him. He could tell there's something going on. My father's worried about something. So he confronted his father. He says, Dad, what's going on? So his father said, this was in 1979, 10 years later, after this third meeting with the Rebbe. So he said like this. He said, right before I left to London, my neighbor came over to me. And my neighbor said, I know you're going now to London. I don't know what you can do, but I need help. My daughter left Judaism. She's not religious anymore. She met this non-Jewish man, and they went together 2 weeks ago to London. You're going to London. Please try to look her up. I don't know how you can, but I need you to try to look her up and try to bring her back to Judaism. That's what his neighbor said. He was very close with his neighbor, and he wanted to help, but what could he possibly do? So he when he came to London with his son and with his family for the wedding, he mentioned this to the father of his son's wife, his mechutin, and his mechutin said, there's this emissary of the Rebbe. His name was Rabbi Tzviklik, who was known as the roaming emissary of the Rebbe, because the Rebbe sent him a lot of mysterious missions. He ever sent him all over the world to do various interesting things. So anyways, Rabbi Tzviklik, he is a Chabad man, and he may know a way to reach your daughter. I think it's worthwhile talking to him. Okay? You might know a way to reach your neighbor's daughter. So Rabbi Avram Tzvi Greenwald goes to meet him the day after the wedding, and he sits down with him, and he tells him what's going on. And Rabbi Glick says, give me the number of your friend in Toronto. I'll call him, try to get more details, and see if I can figure out something. Okay? A few days go by, and Rabbi Glick calls him up. The family decided to stay after the wedding for Chanuka in London. And it was the 5th night of Chanuka. Rabbi Greenwald calls him up, and he says, you must come now. You have to come now to my home. He comes to the home of Rabbi Greenwald, to Rabbi Glick, and they're sitting on the sofa in the living room is this girl, his neighbor's daughter. And she's sitting there, and she's crying, and she's clearly very emotional. Something's going on in her. Something was stirred in her. Some change was going on. And Rabbi Greenwald noticed the menorah next to her in the living room. It was the 5th night of Hanukkah. It was in London. And he realized that the Rebbe's words about whether you're in London, whether you're in New York, whether you're in Warsaw, wherever you are, a Jew has the ability to illuminate his surroundings. These words were prophetic, and they were probably addressing this girl and how she, despite this being decades and decades after the Rebbe initially said those words, these were suited specifically for her, that no matter what's going on, you have the ability to illuminate a Jew, the darkness, no matter what kind of darkness someone may be experiencing. A Jew has the ability to give light to the darkness, and especially someone else's darkness. So there he's very, very touched, and could imagine how overwhelmed he was seeing these words the Rebbe repeat again and again, and how they came to fruition so many years later. So he wanted to share this with the Rebbe. So this was in 1979, Tashlam Etes. So in 1980, it wasn't already easy to get an audience with the Rebbe at that time, but he managed to get an audience with the Rebbe, and he couldn't really share what was going on. He was so emotional, couldn't really share the story, but he shared whatever he shared, and it's very interesting how the Rebbe responded. He responded, my father-in-law, my father-in-law had a very far-off vision. He could see things happening in a very far-off place. So the Rebbe, in his humility, clearly ascribed the divine inspiration in his words to his father-in-law's far-off vision. And an interesting postscript to the story: Rabbi Tzvi Greenwald's oldest child got married in 1989 in Kislev, and right after the Sheva Brachas of his oldest granddaughter, he returned his soul to his Maker, exactly as the Rebbe's blessing. They should be merit to see the wedding of his grandchild. That's the first story I wanted to share. Yuda should do another story. Yuda, it's later already. What do you think?
Of course, but I have a question.
Yeah.
Where is this Where did you hear this story from? Where is it from?
This story is from Rabbi Aaron Dov Halprin, who published a story in Kfar Chabad magazine. Okay, so one more story as Baruch requested. This story, it's also about a very fascinating story, and it's a story not so much about miracles of Hashem, but more about the miracle of a Jew. Rabbi Mendel Wächter is a prominent Torah scholar, and he was from a very prominent family of Satmar Chassidim, and his wife also was from a very prominent family of Satmar Chassidim, and he was the head of a yeshiva in Williamsburg that catered to students who were exceptional outstanding in their genius, in their Torah thoughts, and their learning. And his wife was very close with the Satmar Rebbe, and his wife's family was very close to the Satmar Rebbe, and so his this time the story took place. Just give a little historical context of what happened. There was a lot of opposition at that time, a lot of friction between the Satmar Chassidim towards Lubavitch. It began in more friction was caused in 1977, Tashlam and Zion, when there was a rescue of the Entebbe raid, when there was a plane that was hijacked to Uganda, the Israeli plane, and Israel sent a rescue mission to save the passengers. So the Rebbe spoke about the miracles of God, but the Satmar Chassidim were saying, no, it can't be. There's a miracle of God because the people who did this, people who rescued them weren't religious. It can't be that God does miracles through those who are not religious, and they consider this to be like heretical to say that God would do miracles through these Israelis. But the Rebbe clearly spoke emphatically how this is clearly not the case, and Hashem does miracles through everyone, especially those people who give up their lives and endanger their lives to protect their fellow brothers and sisters. And the Rebbe pointed out how the Satmar Rebbe himself was rescued through someone who was not religious in World War II. Anyways, so the friction grew to the point that in Baruch Hashem things are not the way they were now. Now Baruch Hashem there's great friendship, but at that time there was a lot of opposition and a lot of I don't want to share all of the negative events. I just want to point out the hero of our story. Just to give a little more context, there was a group of Chabad Chassidim in 1982 that, as Rebbe encouraged every holiday to go to various synagogues and bring the joy of the holiday to the various synagogues. So in 1982 on Shavuos, when the Chassidim came through Williamsburg, they were actually attacked physically, and people got hurt. People came out, and it was really not good. It was a huge desecration of God's name. Anyway, so our story takes place in the backdrop of this. Rabbi Mendel Wächter, who was a prominent Satmar Chassid, and he's not suspect of being having any connection with Chabad and Lubavitch. So, but he did like studying Tanya, and Tanya wasn't considered to be banned in Williamsburg at that time. Their fierce opposition. I should say this: there was no real opposition between the Rebbe and the Satmar Rebbe. In fact, there was someone who once visited the Rebbe, and the Satmar Rebbe's name came up, and the guy didn't want to mention his name because he thought the Rebbe would take offense. But the Rebbe said, we're good friends. It's only those who are making machlekas, those who want to make an argument, that try to stir things up, but there's no real separation between us. Anyways, so Rabbi Mendel Wächter, he was studying Tanya, and he was teaching Tanya, but he got up to various parts of the Tanya that he was wondering about, and his yeshiva in the summertime visited New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, he went to this small little synagogue there to pray the afternoon prayer of Mincha, and he noticed a Chabad man there, and he asked him, this man, maybe he can answer his questions in Tanya. This man says, I don't know the answers to your questions, but I can introduce you to someone who knows more than I do. And he introduced him to Rabbi Korf. Rabbi Korf answered some of his questions, but he saw that this man was a bar hachi, was very intelligent, and his questions are perhaps beyond what he could possibly answer. So he said, I wanted to introduce you to someone who knows chassidus a lot more than I do. I want you to introduce you to Rabbi Khan. Rabbi Khan was the chief scribe of the Rebbe. He was one who memorized all the Rebbe's talks every Shabbos and would repeat them verbatim after Shabbos. And he said, I want you to introduce you to him. So Rabbi Vechter, he thought, oh, if Rabbi is a scholar in Hasidic philosophy, he must be like, this aristocratic philosopher kind of guy, and expected to see someone who was, who's wearing aristocratic clothing but Rabbi was nothing but the sort. He was a very down to earth and yet very brilliant scholar of Chassidus. And so together, Rabbi Vechter and Rabbi Korf approached Rabbi Khan, and they asked Rabbi Khan if perhaps he would deign to teach Chassidus to this Rabbi Vechter. But Rabbi Vechter said, I don't want to learn anything from the Rebbe. I don't want to learn things from the Alter Rebbe until the 5th Rebbe of Chabad. But by us in Williamsburg, we consider the Rebbe and his predecessor to be not so kosher. So I don't want to learn anything from them. Rabbi Yel took offense. He wasn't sure how he should respond, and he asked the Rebbe himself how he should respond. The Rebbe said he should teach him chassidus. He should teach him the deeper teachings of the Torah. And basically, what happened was, Rabbi Vechter would come to Rabbi Khan's house every Thursday night, and they would study from 1 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the morning. They would study for 6 hours every Thursday night. Rabbi Vechter was amazed at the depth and the breadth and of Hasidic philosophy. He was overwhelmed. He was amazed. But they had their agreement, and they only studied from the Alter Rebbe to the Rebbe Rashab. But they came up to this part of Tanya. It was chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the section of Tanya which talks about faith. And Rabbi Yoel was sharing with him some questions about this chapter, based upon a talk of the Rebbe. Of course, he didn't mention the Rebbe's name, but he was telling the questions and the answer. Rabbi Vechter was blown away. He says, who says this? So Rabbi Yoel realize this is the moment. So he told him, this is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And Rabbi Vechter couldn't believe it. Like, really? The Lubavitcher Rebbe? Like, how could that be? But from then on, they began studying not just the teachings of the previous Rebbes, but also the teachings of our Rebbe and the previous Rebbe. And Rabbi Vechter was a whole new energy. He started having a whole new energy in his teaching and his learning. And his students felt it. His students felt that something come across our teacher. He's studying Tanya, and he's teaching it with a whole different kind of depth and excitement. And Rabbi Vechter didn't want to upset the apple cart, of course. He didn't quote the Rebbe in Williamsburg. He attributed the Rebbe's teachings to other great scholars. He said, this is a teaching from the Maharal, this is a teaching from Rabbi Chaim, and that's how things went on for a while. But Rabbi Vechter was very passionate. He wanted to share his newfound interest and a connection to Lubavitch with his students, because they were totally in the dark. They were so insulated in this ghetto mindset of that Chabad is heresy, and so he wanted to share something with them. So he invited 2 of his students to come with him to leave the yeshiva and to go with him. He wanted to share something very private with them. They had no idea what the private thing was, and he sits down with them and he tells them, I want you to know that if you want to see someone who serves Hashem with all his heart, with all his soul, and all his might, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you should go to 770 and see the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And for these students, this was like mind-blowing. Here they're blown up their whole life to be told that the teachings of Chabad are heretical, and here Rabbi Vechter, their head of their yeshiva, is telling them, no, it's not that way. Anyways, they kept the secret for a while, but things started to happen and the word came out. What happened was, under the home of Rabbi Vechter, there was a small synagogue, and there were yeshiva students who would study Torah there at night. And Rabbi Vechter is studying at night with great enthusiasm. Some talk of the Rebbe, he's very excited about it. And some very intelligent yeshiva student had this interesting plan. And Rabbi Vechter noticed all of a sudden the floorboard in his home is rising. The floorboard is going up, and there's a head that's peeking out of the floorboard. And this boy comes out of the floor, says, "I caught you. You're learning Chabad chassidus." And Rabbi Vechter didn't acknowledge or deny it. I mean, imagine this guy coming out of the floorboard of his home, whatever. Anyways, shortly afterwards, someone made a disparaging remark about the Rebbe in front of Rabbi Vechter. And Rabbi Vechter, all he said was, not everything they say about Lubavitch is as they say it is. But that caused a whole uproar in the yeshiva. This was something which was so remarkable that the students didn't ignore it. And within 2 days, the yeshiva was closed. And the Rebbe's secretary, a very fascinating thing, he called up the Rebbe's secretary, Rabbi Chanuka, called up Rabbi Vechter's wife and told her the following thing. She was the vice principal of a Satmar girls' school, Bais Rachel, and the Rebbe wanted her to know that in every school there are students who need more attention, whether they come from broken homes or whatever else that's going on. They need more attention, and a new teacher doesn't always realize immediately which students need more attention. So it'd be worthwhile for her to go through the roster of all of her students and see which students need more attention, so that whoever may be taking her over should be able to know which students need more encouragement. So imagine, like, here the Rebbe is trying to assist this school, which views him and his teachings and his chassidim as taboo. But on the Rebbe's mind is, these students need more assistance, because Mrs. Vechter is going to be, eventually she's going to lose her position. Half a day later, she was already expelled from the school. She was fired. And to make matters worse, big signs were put up in Williamsburg. It's a mitzvah to kill her. That's the kind of animosity and angst and misplaced zealousy that was going on at that time. So the Vechters clearly couldn't stay in Williamsburg anymore. They had to move again and again. It's hard to understand the kind of animosity and hatred but that's the way it was at that time. Again, it's not the way it is today. But where I wanted to go was this: when they moved to the various homes, at one point they were living in Borough Park, and there was discovered living in Borough Park. They would send to their home the ambulance. They sent to their home the police. They sent to their home pizza. It would just drive them crazy. Wherever they persecuted them. They would band together outside their home, hundreds of people, and throw eggs at their home. They really had a very hard time. But the worst was this. It was the 9th of Tammuz, in Tavshmem Gimel, 1983. Rabbi Vechter went to the mikveh to immerse himself before prayers in the mikveh, and it was 6 o'clock in the morning, but he did not come back home. And his wife, she knew that this may be the last time she saw her husband. And she called up police, and what happened was this. When he came out of the mikveh, people came in masks, and they took him, they put him in the minivan, and they took off his clothing, and they started to beat him. And they broke every bone in his body. He tried to talk to them, there's a God in the world. They would just beat him up mercilessly. And they beat him up with sticks, and they probably thought that they killed him. He was unconscious. They threw him out of the minivan, and some non-Jewish man was walking by, and he sees he sees this guy who's unconscious, and he calls the police. The police came. Police put him into their car, and in the car, he came back, woke up, and the police, before the ambulance came, brought him back to his home. When he came to his home, this was his reaction. He tells his family, it was all, imagine, they see him, they had shaved off his payas and shaved off his beard with a knife, and they beat him up, and his reaction was, he didn't say this a week later, a month later, a year later, he said immediately then, he said it was all worth it just to learn the teachings of the Rebbe. It was all worth it, all this pain that he experienced, it's all worth it just to be able to learn the teachings of the Rebbe. That's what he said. And the point I wanted to share is that it's Chanuka. Chanuka is about the oil, the miracle of the oil, the inner dimension of the Torah. And we, all of us, have the schus, the merit to be able to study these teachings without sacrificing, without getting hurt. We have to take advantage of these special teachings Hashem is giving us now at the end of the exile before Mashiach comes, and to connect with the oil of the Torah, and to realize that we're in Hashem's hands, and that we're in good hands, and that we're heading now to the time of to see the miracle again, just like it happened in the time of Chanuka, the victory of the many in the hands of the few, and the weak in the hands of the mighty. So we should see this happen tonight with the complete victory of Am Yisrael, coming Mashiach Tzedekenu, Kodem Amish, Agad Yontiv, Hafreilach and Chanuka.
Thank you.
Okay.